Gary Kramer. I'm the Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, located in Columbia. We are the co-publishers of the Ike Skelton memoir with the Southern Illinois University Carbondale Press. Tonight, we're delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here for a continuation of the Kansas City Public Library's Big Read program, the series on True Grit. Tonight's program will consist of Crosby Kemper, the Executive Director of the Kansas City Public Library, and to whom we all owe a great debt of gratitude for the spectacular public programming that is put on here. And Crosby will be interviewing the Honorable Ike Skelton. Ike Skelton, a native of Lexington, Missouri, native of Lexington, a lover of Lexington all of his life. He represented Missouri's 4th District in Congress from 1977 to 2011. He became the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee in 2011 and served until in 2007 and served until 2011. His list of honors is quite long. I think one of his favorite is that he's an honorary U.S. Marine. He's also received the United States Army's Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, the U.S. Navy's Distinguished Public Service Medal, the U.S. Air Force Exceptional Civilian Service Award, and West Point's Sylvanus Thayer Award. I should say also he's a member of the Board of Trustees of my organization, the State Historical Society of Missouri, so he's my boss. He's also currently a partner with the Hush Blackwell law firm. So what we're going to do tonight is that using the memoir as sort of a starting point of conversation, and a book, by the way, which evidences some of the most amazing true grit you're ever going to read about. This book, by the way, will be for sale immediately following the program, and Congressman Skelton has graciously agreed to autograph your copy if and when you buy one. So, Crosby Kemper interviewing the Honorable Ike Skelton. Welcome them, please.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gary, and thank you all for being here, and a special thank you to Congressman Skelton. He probably thought after going up those stairs that now I understood this is a Republican plot to keep him from returning to Washington and getting rid of the problems there. But you know, as Gary said, we're calling this a part of our series, Ike, on True Grit, the novel about the unlikely marshal of the Old West, Rooster Cogburn, who represented true grit. But you are another example, as Gary said, of true grit, a 17-term congressman and chair of the House Armed Services Committee. So we think you're the perfect embodiment of the spirit of what we're trying to do with our reading of true grit. Because you said at one point, I quote you, in fact, I quote you from the first page of Achieving the Honorable, your book, that challenges are best met not with rancor or rhetoric, but with grit and good cheer. So thank you for having your true grit. And I'd like to start by asking you about the moment in your life that probably took the most grit and was probably brought the least cheer to you. But there was a weekend when you were at Wentworth Military Academy, and you were part of the Wentworth Military Academy band, and you went down to the University of Missouri to play at halftime at a Mizzou football game. And when you came back, you had a little bit of a sore throat, and you came back, and the next day, on Sunday, your parents found you unable to get out of bed. You had polio, as it turned out. And what went through your mind? I mean, you were a young man with the world before you, and all of a sudden you had this disease, which in 1946, I think it was, we didn't know how to cure.
Not much. I went to Columbia with the Wentworth Military Academy Band, and we didn't go straight back to Lexington. Wentworth is in Lexington. Some of the band members rented a room in the Daniel Boone Hotel, and I went up there and I passed out on a bed, and they got me on the bus a bit later. I remember walking home, taking a shower, and I couldn't get up from the shower with my left arm. I had to use my right one, and went into my bedroom and collapsed on the bed. My mother found me the next morning, and my left arm wasn't working, and they called the ambulance, and off I went to the General Hospital in Kansas City. You asked for the lowest moment. I haven't reached it yet. I was in a room after they had done the spinal tap test on me, and I cannot remember which parent came in to tell me I had polio. Neither one of them wanted to do it, but one of them came in. I'm guessing it's my mother. It's a little fuzzy. And my answer was, I know it. No big deal. I've had a cold before, and, we've always gotten over it. Then they put me on a stretcher and took me down to my room that I shared with another young man, past all the iron lungs that were in service at the time. And it was that moment, I thought, my gosh, this is real. And from that moment on, I knew this was a fight.
Yeah. And it is hard to put us back because we've more or less solved the polio problem today. That it was a truly debilitating thing with people who couldn't move, and so it must have been frightening to you. Another part of the story that does relate to your political career is Warm Springs, Georgia, where there was the great sanitarium, which was created by another great American politician, another great optimist under trying circumstances.
Franklin Roosevelt had polio, and he was, the public didn't really know this that well, but he was really, really handicapped with both legs up into his middle part of his anatomy. And he heard that there was a place in Georgia with a resort called Meriwether Inn, and the springs there were warm and they were healthy. So he went down, and at the end of the day, bought Meriwether Inn, and then built a hospital, which he didn't use the word hospital, it was a foundation.
Right.
And everybody called it the foundation. As a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago, I took my wife Patty and my son Jim by there. I had an event at Fort Benning, Georgia, and they were nice enough to drive me by Warm Springs for a couple of 3 hours and then on to the airport in Atlanta. It was a very, very important place for a lot of people. And I hope I make that clear in the book.
It's very clear in the book, I think, about how important it was to you, and in many ways. You talk about your roommates and how you stayed in touch with them. You talk about the therapists who came to your to swearing in to Congress, many years later. Your Latin teacher, who you said was really good looking. Sorry, Patty.
I've got to tell you that. My wife, where's my wife, Patty?
She's right over there.
Where?
Oh, right
hey,
there.
Patty, she won't like this. I was taking first year Latin, and the instructor was a Mrs. Shipley, crotchety old gal, and it wasn't much fun. Latin's not much fun.
You weren't doing that well.
I wasn't doing that well.
Yeah. She was
And mid through the semester, a new Latin teacher came to Warm Springs. 23-year-old college graduate and absolutely gorgeous. My grade went up to a B+.
People always appreciated beautiful women. Well, you know, it's interesting to me, and you talk about this a little bit in the book, the differences between then and now, between the way FDR treated his polio. He basically, and it's, you know, his story about it, many people have seen Sunrise at Campobello, or you know, is a very inspiring story in a lot of ways about how he overcame to become president, to become a functioning politician, overcame his polio, but he kept it a secret.
He did.
And today we wouldn't, you wouldn't.
And the press cooperated with him. As far as historians know, there was one picture taken of him in a wheelchair with a granddaughter standing beside him. And I understand that. And I think were he alive, he would not appreciate the Roosevelt Memorial showing him in a wheelchair. Mm-hmm. That was the syndrome that was prevalent at Warm Springs. I'm just as able-bodied as you are.
Right.
And they taught that mentality. It's really interesting about Warm Springs that everybody that came, and I was in pretty good shape compared to most of them, although I was in a wheelchair for a while, everybody left there with a positive attitude. And it was just a positive place. You felt that Franklin Roosevelt was there urging you on. And I can't describe it better than that.
Well, I think that it's one of the moving parts of your book that, in a way, both at the beginning and at the end, you talk about this and how Franklin Roosevelt's spirit. You talk about hard work and determination at one point in discussing this is there with you, and it is remarkable. I hope you don't mind talking about this, but there are a lot of day-to-day tasks that are more difficult for you than they are for most of us, and there's no sense in your career, no sense in this book that's been a meaningful impediment to you, and you owe it in some reasonable degree to Franklin Roosevelt.
Well,
that attitude. Well, besides this problem that you've overcome, you had in some ways a very conventional growing up. You're an Eagle Scout, Lexington, Missouri, small town values, but there were important people in your life who expressed those values for you, like your father.
Well, of course, needless to say, he was a great influence in many ways. A very well-known trial lawyer. I spent 5 summers being an office boy for him, but as a little boy, I would go to court with him. And one very, very important case, I think I was probably 9, maybe 10, I went to see, the courtroom was packed, and I got a bottle of orange soda pop, and just like I owned the place, I went up to beyond the bench and sat there with the lawyers drinking my orange soda pop, and I learned later I shouldn't have done that.
You say he was a little bit of a disciplinarian, but you say you sort of welcomed it. He spanked you once, and you felt that you deserved it. And
well, not really.
No. Okay. So anyway, after Warm Springs and a lot of medical attention, you went back to Wentworth.
Well, I went to Wentworth my freshman year in high school. My second year in high school. It was at Wentworth, and that was when I had the great desire to go to West Point. This tough military came pretty easy, and I enjoyed it. But you had to make good grades, and I was really studying, and the grades that year really up. And November 9 and 10 was the weekend I got polio. But that was my great desire to go to West Point.
Your father had, at underage, had enlisted in World War I and was on the USS Missouri.
In the Great War, he, if you're going to join a service at the age of 17, you have to have your mother's or a parent permission. And of course, he didn't have a father. His father got killed by Truman when he was 7, but his mother wouldn't sign. So he went up and convinced the Navy recruiter he was 18 years old. And he was sent to Great Lakes. And I have a really interesting letter from him to his mother from Great Lakes. It's telling all about the training. And then he was assigned to USS Missouri of the day. There have been 5 USS Missouris, by the way. The one out in Hawaii is the 4th. The 5th one is one that we commissioned a couple of years ago. It's a submarine. Well, he was aboard the 3rd USS Missouri, a battleship of the Great White Fleet of Teddy Roosevelt, by the way. And he was a coal shoveling fireman. And I'm convinced that his tour in the Navy, he'd never been out of Higginsville, Missouri. His tour in the Navy, undoubtedly, was the defining moment of his life, no question about it. And he came back, finished high school, worked his way through the University of Missouri undergraduate and law school, and was a top student, as well as working his way through, and became a great lawyer.
And so you wanted to become a great lawyer and a politician, which he was. But you also at Wentworth, you were able to, despite your polio, letter and track.
I came back to Wentworth for junior college and did well scholastically. Went out for track and was able to run the 2-mile. And the best I ever did was a few third places, but it's still 1 point for the team.
And you lettered. So you graduated from Wentworth and you went to the University of Missouri.
Yes.
Again, but not only following your father, but being a little competitive with him in terms of your grades and all that, and going on to law school. But you also had you had some great teachers.
I did.
One of the things that I think probably anybody who's followed Ike Skelton's career knows about him is he's one of the great students of history that we've had in public life. And that was engendered obviously by your father to some degree and your mother, but also by these great professors you had at the University of Missouri.
Yeah, no question about it. Dr. Lewis Atherton, an expert on the westward movement.
Main Street on the Middle Border, he wrote.
It was, yes.
Classic.
You must know I have one claim to fame in my life, and it happened in his class. There were about 25 in his class. It was an advanced class, history of the South, 5-hour course. You're in his class every day of the week, and we were seated in alphabetical order. And I sat next to a fellow named Scott. Nice guy, a little older. I knew that he did lead roles, male roles in plays down at Stevens College, but no big deal. And he got a good grade, and I was fortunate enough to make a good grade in the class. And he disappeared on me. I never saw Scotty again until 1959. I went to see the movie Anatomy of a Murder. And the fellow who was playing the assistant attorney general prosecuting the soldier for murder was Scotty.
George C. Scott.
That's it. That's it.
So obviously he learned historical accuracy in your history class with you. So how was his patent? Was his patent historically accurate?
As much as anybody could be.
Pretty close
Yes.
enough.
I never met Jerome Patton, but as much, I've read a great deal about him, and as much as anybody could be, he was a very complicated man.
And you also had John Neihart as a professor.
Dr. John G. Neihart had a class. He was a poet. He wrote a book entitled Cycle of the West and had 6 if I remember right, 6 songs, 6 lengthy poems about the westward movement. And his class period consisted of him reading part of a poem and then explaining it. It was absolutely fascinating. And he did, a few years later, an interview with David Frost, which was a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And if I can ever get a hold of that,
We need to find that and
You
play it here.
You should.
That would be great. He also wrote Black Elk Speaks, which many of you will know, and is on what we call our community bookshelf, the heroic book spines on the garage, one of the classics of American literature, I think. Well, so you went to Mizzou. You also spent a summer in Edinburgh, at the University of Edinburgh. Now, I thought maybe initially that was about history, but in the book you also talk about the quaint pubs. Is that part of the attraction?
I should have left that out.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Well, it was a course entitled The Winning of the West, something like that, but it was about England.
Western civilization.
Yes,
Yeah.
Europe, England, well, some about America, not much. And they were the important professors, some of them all the way from Rome.
Wow.
And it was very fascinating. It was in a classroom, it looked like a surgical auditorium.
Right.
And it was good. In the afternoon, they would have tutorials or seminars with very, very bright students, and that's where I had enough sense to listen.
Right.
But it was very interesting. 3 of us buddied together, and we would explore the downtown of Edinburgh, which is a beautiful place, beautiful place. And there was one pub that we went into once in a while. That's where I met a British soldier, Scottish soldier, by the name of Ernest Whiteoak. I saw the soldier standing at the bar with his kilts and his Scottish cap with the ribbons down the back, and I invited him to join us, and that began a lifelong friendship with Regimental Sergeant Major Ernest Whiteoak. He and his wife Molly visited us in America a couple of times, and my youngest son visited them, and it was very, very interesting. And another example, an incident that happened in the pub there. I was waiting for my 2 buddies, and I was sitting there with 2 elderly Scottish gentlemen, Pot and Mike. Translated as Pat and Mike, but it was Pot and Mike. And there was a glass of water in front of me, and I picked it up and said, "Cheers." And this one, I don't know which one, grabbed my arm and slammed it down. Never do that. Never do that. Every time you toast with water, a British sailor goes to his death.
Whoa.
And
I'll never do that again, I promise.
And he believed it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought I'd share that with you.
Well,
Don't cheer with water.
You know, never again. There are 2 themes here that I think go through your life: your interest in history and your ability to create friends in unlikely places, like across the aisle in Congress. And you went back to the University of Missouri for law school, again following in the footsteps of your father. But before you even passed the bar, you were running for prosecutor.
Yes, in March of my senior year in law school, I filed for prosecuting attorney of Lafayette County, and taking the bar exam, which was not much of a thrill.
But you
I
passed.
won the primary unopposed 4 days before I learned I passed the bar. I did have a real election at the general election, however.
But you did eventually, you became the youngest prosecutor in
That's
the
right.
history of Lafayette County, maybe in the history of Missouri?
Well, I was
Certainly Lafayette County.
I was 24. Interesting story goes along with that. One of my mentors was a fellow named Tom Hennings. He was a United States Senator who I met at Harry Truman's inauguration. And we became friends, and he would write me, or on occasion I would visit with him, and very encouraging to me. His whole psyche was encouragement, to, at least as far as I was concerned. The last Saturday before the election was in my hometown, and I was walking down Main Street, going to each house and leaving a card or speaking to whoever was there, and telling them I'm Ike Skelton Jr., running for prosecuting attorney. Certainly appreciate your vote. And a big black car rolled up beside me and yelled at me, and it was Senator Hennings campaigning for re-election. His wife and his driver, and they asked me to get in and go to the top of the hill, which I did. And we chatted for a while. He was in the front seat, and he said, "How's your campaign going?" And I said, "Well, Senator, they're using my age against me." And he said, "Well, how old are you?" I said, 24. And he turned and looked at me and said, "Just remember, William Pitt was elected Prime Minister of Great Britain at the age of 24. Now you get out there and win."
Yeah, and you did.
Yeah.
And you did. Well, so you had your career as prosecutor, and then you became, for a while, Assistant Attorney General to Tom Eagleton.
Yeah, that was a special assistant attorney general. Was a pattern that attorney generals had for years. I don't know if it's still there or not, but civilian lawyers across the state would be hired to handle 3 cases a year before the Missouri Supreme Court. Cases that had been tried by a local prosecuting attorney and won a conviction, and then it was up to the Attorney General's office to sustain that conviction. And Tom Eagleton hired me for 3 cases a year before the Missouri Supreme Court. And I would brief the case and argue it before the Supreme Court. And the remuneration was all of $400 a case, but it was great. Just think of this: a young lawyer, 3 times a year, getting the opportunity to argue a case before a Supreme Court. It was good. It was fun.
Well, and Tom Eagleton was himself a pretty interesting guy.
Oh, he was a good friend.
A great man in many ways.
Prosecuting attorneys at the same time. I was prosecutor of Lafayette County, and Tom was the circuit attorney in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And a good guy.
So your political career is advancing. You certainly with Senator Hennings and future Senator Eagleton. You've got great relationships. At some point in your career, there's a long-term Congressman, Bill Randall, in the fourth district, a Democratic congressman, and you're thinking about his seat. You get a phone call from Harry Truman asking you to run.
We're confusing 2 events.
Okay, it's happened before.
It was 1959. George Christopher, congressman, died. He was from Butler, Missouri. And I was one of the candidates. I was all of 28 years old. One of the candidates that appeared before the District Democratic Committee. And at the end of the day, they got hung up between a city-oriented group and a rural group, and they compromised that with Bill Randall, and I was in that mix, but they chose Bill Randall, and he was there, I think, some 19 years.
Right. But at some point, Harry Truman did call you and ask you to run against him in the primary, right?
Attorney General's office working on a case, and in the back office, and a secretary came running in and said that I was wanted on the telephone, and it was Rufus Burrus, a prominent lawyer from Independence and the family lawyer for the Truman family. And he said that President Truman wanted me to run for Congress. This was the last day for filing, and I thanked him very much. And I'd just gotten married recently and trying to get my law practice going. And I hung up, and about 15 minutes later, a secretary came running in and said, it's the president on the phone. So I went to the phone, and sure enough, it was President Truman that urged me the same thing. He would support me, and I thanked him, and I was flattered, but I didn't do it. I went home and wrote him a nice thank you letter, and, which is still, along with a copy of the letter he wrote me, telling me why he wanted me to run. Yeah. But it was a thrill.
Somebody to represent the welfare of the district, he said to you.
In his letter, yes.
Yeah.
I have both these letters sent out in the book.
And so, but in the meantime, you get elected to the state senate. You do.
Well, I was seriously considering running for Congress in 1970, and it was obvious from a poll that I would run well in the Democratic district, but I probably wouldn't win. So I was a racehorse looking for a race, and I ran for the state senate and had a landslide victory, 348 votes. That was over 42,000. But I was still elected.
But you were elected, and one of your great accomplishments, which foretells, I think, some of your great accomplishments in the United States House of Representatives, is Missouri decided, you decided, to revise the criminal code of the state of Missouri, which hadn't been revised since Jesse James first violated it, and you worked with Jean Paul Bradshaw, if I understand correctly, from the
Jean
book.
Paul Bradshaw was a Republican state senator from Springfield, and a brilliant guy, first-class state senator, and a friend. And he joined with me to revise the Missouri criminal code. And we didn't get it done, but I was in my first year in Congress, and I get this phone call from a senator, Senator Murray, as my recollection is, they just got it passed.
Yeah.
So,
but it establishes a theme of your career, a theme which I have to say is particularly important right now, of working across the aisle, your ability to work in a bipartisan way to get the people's business done. We don't have enough of that today. Would you agree with?
Well, there's an end game to get it done, and you remember your boss is really the people that elect you, and there are real challenges to a lot of pieces of legislation, but there are very few that cannot be worked out. It was as a first venture on the Armed Services Committee all the way up to chairmanship. It's a matter of working with those on the subcommittee or on the committee that understand that this is really important that we get it done. And you change that and I'll change this. And at the end of the day, you get some pretty good legislation.
Yeah. And so you do get elected to Congress finally, 1976, a good year for Democrats post-Watergate.
That's correct.
And Bob Dole endorsed you for the United States Congress. How did that happen?
Well, it was interesting. My Republican opponent, good guy, he's gone now, Dick King, and I had a debate in televised debate in Warrensburg, Missouri. But we have to have it earlier in the afternoon because he had to leave to go to a big Republican rally on the old Independence Courthouse steps. which, by the way, we rededicated just a few weeks ago and made it the Truman Courthouse. Well, he got a helicopter and went up to the rally. And Bob Dole was running for vice president. And in his speech, he was on a roll. You have to re-elect Kit Bond governor. You have to elect John Danforth senator. You have to elect John Ashcroft attorney general. You have to elect Ike Skelton to the Congress.
Oops.
And somebody yelled, "He's not ours." And I have all this on tape. The radio was taping it. And I thank Bob Dole whenever I see him. Of course,
right, yeah.
When he publicly would tell of this incident, of course he made it funnier, as Bob Dole was. My wife and I went to Arlington Cemetery on Memorial Day, and there are several steps in front of the unknown soldiers. And since we were in an office as chairman, we were led down after the steps were filled with VIPs. And we were in the very front row. And I heard this voice say, "That's Congressman Ike Skelton." Of course, you couldn't mistake that voice. It was Bob Dole in the back on one of the steps. I endorsed him for Congress. You know, and everybody, of course, heard him say it.
Good laugh.
What a good guy.
Yeah. So you get to Congress, and eventually you get on the Armed Services Committee, and you talk about this.
I have to thank Dick Bowling for that.
Yeah.
Dick Bowling was your congressman from right here in
The 5th
Kansas
District.
City, Jackson County,
Yeah.
and he was a mentor and a good friend.
Chairman of the Rules Committee, one of the most
Yes.
powerful, quietly behind the scenes, one of the most powerful men in
No
Congress.
question about it.
A long tradition of that in Missouri, it should be said, with Champ Clark and Roy Blunt and Ike Skelton. So you get on the Armed Services Committee, which is eventually, and due to Dick Bowling, and you talk about it very eloquently in the book about coming on at a moment that may be the nadir for the American Armed Forces in the 20th century, the moment when we had the failed hostage rescue in Iran. Then President Reagan comes along. We have Grenada, which is successful, but soldiers are having to use their own phones to try and communicate with each other. I mean, not the Army issued, because Army and Navy and Air Force is not talking to each other, communications. You got the Marine barracks in Beirut blown up with 240. You talk about the low point, and
It was a low point for our military, but let's go back just a little. There's a fellow named Arch Barrett, retired Air Force colonel, who, after he got out of the Air Force, got a PhD at Harvard, and then became a staff member for the Armed Services Committee. And he staffed the subcommittee then chaired by a fellow named Richard White from Texas. And they had a series of hearings on lack of cooperation between the services. No jointness, as we call it.
yeah.
And then Dick White retired. And Arch Barrett came to me and urged me to take up the cause. And after a while, I thought this would be a good challenge. And we took it up, and I introduced legislation that abolished the Joint Chiefs of Staff who were not getting along.
That made you popular with a lot of people, I'll bet.
It was, every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff except one gave me a lecture on what I was doing was terrible. It was necessary.
Well, and you talk about how incremental change is important, and though you didn't pass that bill,
Well, for 4 years, we would pass a bill each year, the bill being better written, and it was killed by John Tower, who was then the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he left the Senate. The fellow named Goldwater became chairman of the United States Senate, and he thought this was a good idea. And so the Senate passed its own bill requiring jointness within the military. And after both the House and the Senate passed the bill, we went into conference to work out the differences, and that went pretty smooth until we reached the issue of the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The entire Joint Chiefs were against a vice chairman, and I was for it. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bill Crow, lovely guy, came to my office and said, I'm going to go to the mat against this vice chairmanship. And I said to myself, I'm going to go to the mat for it. And thanks to Sam Nunn from Georgia, we got it worked out. And what we did, we gave the country a vice chairman of the Defense Department. And then a couple of years later, we changed it and gave him his full powers. So today, if the chairman is gone, he has full powers to replace what he does. And jointness in American military is part of the culture today. It is required instruction in all of the war colleges. And they fight together, they plan together, they speak to each other. And I think what we did was really monumental. A bit bigger, really bigger than we had dreamed.
Yeah, it's a most interesting part of your book, because you talk about Tower and Goldwater, who some of us would have seen ideologically as being very similar, but how different they were to work with and make these reforms happen. And you talk about Les Aspin too, who was on very much the other side of the fence, had been very anti-Vietnam.
He was an excellent chairman.
But was a great chairman, and as you point out in the book, gets a lot of things done.
He did, yeah.
And creating a lot of opposition on his side of the fence, your side of the fence, and the Democratic Party to get those things done. Another thing that you did in Congress, and you did for all of us, is you became a great champion for Missouri and for bringing things to Missouri and preserving things in Missouri, like the Whiteman Air Force Base, the old Sedalia Naval Air Station, or whatever.
Whiteman Air Force Base.
And Fort Leonard Wood, and
you had two great institutions, neither of which was being loved by their own service. We had Whiteman Air Force Base, which had missiles, and they were becoming of a near extinct variety. And I needed to put something there to keep it alive. And then in 1983, I was invited to the Pentagon to see a new weapons system. Air Force Brigadier General and a civilian Department of Defense officer took me into a little room, and they showed me some plans that looked like a bat, and I said, does that thing fly? And the answer was it's supposed to. Well, this was later became known as the stealth bomber. And then then they went public with it, and we had some serious opposition because it was $2 billion a copy. And Dick Cheney was the chairman of he was the Secretary of Defense. 132 of them, then 75, and we were fortunate to get 15 paid for, then another 5 a year later, then after that another 1, a total of 21. And history has exonerated them because there have been 4 incidents where they've been used in combat without losing a single one, because they could fly over and drop a bomb, and no one knows until the bomb goes off.
Right. And then the second challenge was
to get that assigned to Whiteman.
Whiteman, yes.
And I had the help of a 2-star, later 4-star general, Jim McCarthy, over cookies and milk at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. We planned out how it was going to happen. He was trying to help me, and he did help me. And the Secretary of Defense called me over in early December and asked if I would like to make the announcement that we're going to put the stealth bomber at Whiteman Air Force Base. And of course, I held a news conference at Knob Noster, just outside of Whiteman, about the stealth bomber. It was later given the designation of the B-2, but at that time it was not. And sure enough, 10 years later, 1993, 10 years after I first learned about it, 1993, the first bomber came in, flown by a General Lowe on the anniversary of the first flight in North Carolina by the Wright brothers.
It's hard to believe that Knob Noster, Missouri is the technological center of the modern military. But thanks to you, it is.
But it is.
And so, 9/11 comes along, and you're a ranking member on the Armed Services Committee. That's an important moment. You give a great speech. I think it's on the floor of the House about the attack really being an attack on American idealism. You say you tell Americans to take out their flags and fly them, which I thought was a great line. And then there's the invasion of Iraq. But maybe your most famous moment in Congress is the letter that you sent to the President and the Secretary of Defense as we're about to go to war in Iraq, which is...
We were invited, several of us were invited over to the White House to visit with the President about the problems in Iraq. The intelligence was a bit shaky, but the President believed it, as well as other members of his staff, including the Secretary of Defense, Sonny Rumsfeld. And after I visited with the President, I went back and thought that they have not really thought this through. In every military effort that I can remember, there have always been unanticipated consequences. You cannot always make sure what you plan comes to pass. So I wrote a letter to the President spelling that out, that they have not thought of the end game.
The end game. What happens after our military victory was clearly going to happen.
Well, it did come to pass. Although I voted for it and didn't support it because the President thought he needed it. If you can't believe the President, something like that, well, I did. But the aftermath, as you know,
has continued to be
pretty fuzzy,
problematic.
and it still is.
Yeah.
Although no Americans there now.
Yeah. You opposed initially, at least, the surge, and your view of that now is it was successful but not successful enough, or it wasn't successful, or?
It's a temporary success.
A temporary success. You have a great line. George Santayana, the Harvard philosopher, is famous for saying those who forget the history are condemned to repeat it. But you have a line that I didn't know, I didn't remember from Santayana, which is great, and which seems to me to describe a lot of American foreign policy in the last couple of decades. Americans never solve their problems; they just bid them goodbye. You quote that in your book. So nation building we haven't been very good at. Staying power of American foreign policy, we kind of walked away without finishing things.
It's true. It's part of our nature.
Yeah.
That's why it's better to anticipate and plan for problems that you're not thinking of when you go in.
Well, and you make the point in the book that there are moments in history, like after World War II, when we stick around in Germany and Japan, and we help them get back on their feet. So
It worked.
And it worked.
We had planners long before the end of World War II, how we would occupy both Germany and Japan. Well thought out, and it worked. And you have to give a lot of credit, though he ran afoul of President Truman. You have to give a lot of credit to General Douglas MacArthur, who did a masterful job in the occupation of Japan.
You became chair of the Armed Services Committee in 2007. There were a lot of issues that you had to deal with, from the surge to the huge budget problems as we start to go into the late unpleasantness, the recession, don't ask, don't tell, et cetera. But at the same time, you again, this is sort of a theme of your career. You work on a bipartisan basis. In fact, in the book, you say the last place for bipartisanship in the Congress may be the Armed Services Committee.
Yeah, I think that's the case. We really worked hard, the Democrats and Republicans alike, to keep the Armed Services Committee bipartisan. And it worked. It really did. Of course, we, from time to time, would have debates that were somewhat partisan. But at the end of the day, we got the job done. And we could sit down with our counterparts on the other side of the aisle. One of the areas in which, one of the efforts in which friendship arises, when you make a trip overseas with someone on the other side of the aisle. And I made some fast friends that way. Randy Forbes from Virginia and I planted a tree in Kunming, China, in honor of the American flying tigers and those who flew over the hump, over the Himalayas, and landed at Kunming, bringing supplies during the Second World War. And where in Kunming is the flower capital of China, which I didn't know, and this on top of a rather large hill. And there were some Chinese diplomats. This was a good 5-6 years ago. And of course, Randy Forbes and I each made brilliant speeches. But the Chinese had some high-level diplomats there, and they spoke, but what was interesting was they never used the word Japan or Japanese. They referred to the aggressor.
Yeah.
And but there were flowers all over, flower petals all over the area. And it was a truly a memorable moment, but a great bipartisan moment.
Wait, let's talk about China for a second. You talk about our failure to look at foreign policy and military policy in long-term ways. And China is an example, and I think you use the example of what we've done with the Navy as perhaps being a mistake, that the Chinese are building their Navy dramatically, and imports and exports are a huge thing in their economy and our economy, and keeping the sea lanes open, if only symbolically, might be seen to be important, but we've reduced our Navy from 600 ships to 300 ships or something like that in the last...
Shades of Ronald Reagan's 600-ship Navy.
Yeah, which we never really got
Yeah,
to. But
you know, ships are very expensive.
Yeah.
Very expensive. When a new one is christened and later becomes part of the American fleet, there's a lot of money tied up in it, and like $1 billion for an attack submarine. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, the last USS Missouri, one that is new, is an up-to-date attack submarine, and we commissioned it just a very few years ago.
Well, You've had a very bipartisan career in the House, and you voted actually in favor of the Contras at one point when that was a very ideological issue. You voted against Obamacare, which one would have thought might have protected you in a more conservative district. How do you feel about that vote today? I mean, we're right in the middle of the beginning of the implementation of that. It's become the most partisan issue we've had in a generation, which is saying a lot. And is there any way out of this dilemma? This total partisanship that we now seem to have? I mean, you were on the other side.
Well, I did vote against it because it stripped well over $200 million away from small town hospitals. And that's the lifeblood. Medicare is the lifeblood of small town hospitals, and didn't want that to happen. It also was not very popular in the district. So I voted against it, which was the right vote, A, for the district, and B, for the facts as I saw them. But it is a law of the land. And as many new things come to pass, such as Social Security, the bugs get worked out over a period of time. And right now, of course, it's such a partisan issue. When the dust settles, and it will eventually settle, the problems with it will get worked out. And I'm convinced at the end of the day, it's going to do the job. But there are problems in parts of it, and it's up to Congress to help fix them.
Well, you in the election, in your last successful election, you got 68% of the vote in your district. And you had, for a Democrat, a very conservative record, a centrist record, certainly, and yet you were defeated. And you've got a line in the book that, again, I liked, saying the middle ground is the high ground. But it seems like we've lost the middle ground. We've lost anybody wanting to even hold the middle ground. Everybody's moving to the edges. And though I'm probably a lot more conservative than you are, I distrust politics where you can't find the middle ground, because sometimes you just have to get
Just remember, those who are elected really reflect the district in which they are elected, or they're not there very long. They did elect those who are causing a bottleneck in the legislature now. They are elected, and you still have to look back to those who elected them.
Right. It's your fault. Our fault.
And someday, it will change.
Right.
If this country is to survive, there's going to have to be an understanding of us getting along and getting the right thing done, whether it be the budget or our health care, you name it. It has to be done in matters of national security, or else there will be a terrible penalty. These are difficult times, and there is a lot of potential threat out there. And our intelligence, whether it be military intelligence or the civilian like the CIA, are good. They're very, very good. And to allow them to do well, you not only have to pay for it, pay for analysis, pay for people who can decipher the messages going over the wires. You have to do better in the learning of languages. You have to do better in diplomacy. All of this requires skill and planning. And hopefully we can get there someday.
Well, you say in the book that history teaches us that when we don't engage with the world, there are, as you said before, the law of unintended consequences always comes to play.
You know, and you have to really take your hat off to Harry Truman. There was not a more difficult time in our nation's history than the beginning of the Cold War. And I doubt if anyone could have handled it as well as he did. The Berlin airlift, the splitting of Berlin itself, the wall that went up, and the actual Cold War that was on, the spies that were found from time to time. Harry Truman did a magnificent job, and but it set the stage for many years until the wall came down.
Well, you are yourself a great historian, and you talk about a conversation you had once with Stephen Ambrose.
Yes.
About what makes us different.
Yeah, Dr. Stephen Ambrose, if you will recall, wrote the book Undaunted Courage about the journey of Lewis and Clark from St. Louis up Missouri River and to the West Coast. And he did a great deal of research, and he told us about this. I had him in for a little breakfast in my office and invited a few of the members of Congress and some of my staff. And he was getting ready to leave, and I asked him, Dr. Ambrose, what is it that makes America so unique and so great? Here's his answer. Look at Russia. Russia never had a George Washington, a John Adams, a Thomas Jefferson, a James Monroe, or the values they established. The values they established. He said Russia has the hardy workforce, and Russia has more natural resources than all of North America. But without those values, they didn't make it, and we did. So we're blessed to have people like that. As long as we can produce people like that and understand those values and continue those values, we're going to make it.
We have produced men like that, it seems to me, in recent history. You know, at the end of the book, you talk about, at the beginning of the book, you talk about wanting to go, before you got polio, to West Point. And at the end of the book, Gary mentioned this in his introduction, you were invited to West Point and given the Sylvanus Thayer Award, which is to represent the values of duty, honor, country, and, if I may say so, true grit. Ladies and gentlemen, Ike Skelton. I think the congressman has agreed to take 2 or 3 questions before he'll sign books. So, have we got a couple of questions?
Hand this to me.
Yeah.
Hand that to me.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yes, sir.
Skelton, I also am a Wentworth alumni, and I am privileged to know that you also were many times there at our homecoming, and I appreciate that. I'm also privileged to have been a graduate of the Joint Professional Military Education, which you established in the military. I'd like to ask you, the education of American public is in trouble. What do you believe would be a solution?
Say it again.
Education of the American public is in trouble. What's our solution?
I better ask my wife, a career school teacher, to answer that. Well, I will give you my standard lecture on the importance of Americans understanding history. I forget who said it, but it was said by someone in a speech not that long ago that Americans can't remember what others can't forget. We have an absolutely marvelous history. A lot of bumps, a lot of bad things, but America, at the end of the day, would come out on the right side. And we have to inculcate that in young people today. Now, everybody is not a historian, but it's the understanding of history. The fact that we do things that are very difficult, both domestically and internationally. I am, as of 3 weeks ago, chairman of the World War I Centennial Commission. The president appointed me, as well as a few others, and I'm blessed to be the chairman, and my job is to do the best to let young people understand what that was all about and the sacrifices that Americans made. All of them, the participants, they're gone now. My daddy's generation is gone. But they did make great sacrifices and propelled us onto the world stage. But for us, I am convinced after the study of the First World War, which was known as the Great War, or the war to end all wars, I'm convinced that Germany would have won that war had we not turned the tide in late 1917 and all of 1918. But sadly, the Versailles Treaty paved the way for Germany to get started on his Second World War. But the sacrifice that they made, and a lot of them didn't come home. My father's secretary, later my secretary in practicing law, lost her older brother, George Thomas Cullum, and in the Argonne Forest, and the American Legion Post in Lexington is named after him, as a matter of fact. We're going to have to do a better job of teaching our children. Whether, I got the fill of it from my father, who was a historian, history major before he went to law school, and understood the importance of my knowing it. And I guess I picked up a little of it.
You know, one of the many reasons to buy this book is at the end, in an appendix, there is something, this actually went viral nationally. Ike was asked to create a list of books, history books you should read. I think the National Defense University published this originally, and it's a great list of books. One of the interesting sort of sub-themes in your list of books like that I found so interesting is there are a lot of people, biographies and books about people who might be described as failures, Hannibal or Robert E. Lee, but who had nobility in their failures. But if you want a good reading list in history, it's in the appendix to this book.
It's interesting to run into military officers from time to time, and they tell me that they've read so many books on my list.
Yeah. Another question or two, or should we go out to sign books?
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you all.